Greetings, Philadelphia. This is Wayne Au, shooting a video here in Seattle. Um, just by way of introduction, I'm an associate professor at the University of Washington, Bothell, and I'm also an editor at Rethinking Schools, and I'm pretty present as a local sort of activist around high stakes standardized testing, and also most recently um, around charter schools. I'm going to give a shout out to my longtime friend now, I guess I could say that, Kelly, calling. She's for making the connection and having me provide some remarks, the long distance at least. And basically, I was asked to sort of talk about high stakes standardized testing and touch on four different things. One is sort of the history of testing and some of the political implications of that history. I was also asked to sort of address the question of, do we need high stakes testing in order to sort of ensure the quality education of children of color? Um, and the third piece I was asked to address was to sort of touch on the relationship between white supremacy and high stakes testing, and then also to sort of discuss some of the what I see are some of the best strategies to combat testing. And I'm just going to say this up front. I'm sort of shooting this video on my computer, and it's going to be an unedited one-shot deal. So please forgive any sort of sloppiness around any sloppiness that comes out from this. Anyways, so let's get to it. When we look at the history of high stakes standardized testing, we see standardized testing before it was high stakes. We see standardized testing sort of arising in the United States in particular, right around the late 1800s and early 1900s. And there's a couple things that are important to note around this. First is that when you get to the early 1900s, we're looking at the beginning of mass schooling in this country, right? And this also coincides with sort of the beginning of like having like child labor laws. And so they literally had this thing like, okay, all these kids can't work in the factories anymore. What are we going to do with them? And so the idea of having mass schooling sort of came hand in hand, from the perspective of political economy at least, came hand in hand with with sort of the release of children from their terrible working conditions in the factories here in the U.S. And so that's one piece of it. At the same time, we're also going through this huge industrial leap in the U.S. And the modernization and the rise of factories. And so at the same time mass schooling starts, we're also getting this shift in this framing of schooling as in a factory model, in a business like model, right? And so you can see this stuff lingering now, well over 100 years later, where, for instance, we have, take the modern day high school, which still pretty much is this huge factory, and it's set up as an assembly line model, right? And so you have, students moving from teacher to teacher at timed intervals, and after they do their time, they get their diploma, and they've been stamped as basically as inspected, and they're a done product. And so we can see this framing, and the reason why testing connects to these two things is because so you have all these kids, you have the rise of mass schooling and the sort of factory model of education. Standardized testing came about as one of the key technologies, and we need to understand it as a technology for the efficient sorting of these huge populations. Right. This period of time also is connected directly to the roots of tracking as well. And the tests were sort of brought in as a way to say, the administrators, policymakers, and even professors at the time were promoting these tests as supposedly an accurate and objective way to sort and rank children according to their future life professions. All right. Now we know that they were not objective. Okay. We know that for a fact, and we know that what happened was they ended up reproducing pretty much every single major social and economic inequity that you had at that time. And so here's the other piece, then the other important piece around looking at the history of high stakes standardized testing and going back to this period of time, early 1900s, late 1800s in the U.S., was that this was also during a pretty strong eugenics movement in the United States. And by eugenics movement, we're talking about this whole idea that people's behavior can be attributed to genetic factors. And the reason why this is important is because what happened is then the eugenicists, they glommed onto the idea of standardized testing at this time, because they said, hey, look, oh, this is, these top psychologists say that this testing is the way to accurately and objectively measure all these humans. Um, and so the eugenicists were like, man, look at the test results. Wow, poor people are by the test results, poor people are just less intelligent than rich people. And then look, black people, native people, they are just less intelligent than white people. But then immigrants, they are also less intelligent than the U.S. born. And so the test results ended up mirroring all of these race and class inequalities that existed at that time. And then that data was then in turn used to essentially reinforce all of these racist ideas and policies that were sort of popping out all over the place, in sort of a post Reconstruction United States. And so we get this sort of mixing of the high stakes standardized tests, the factory model of schools, and then all these racist notions underpinning the tests. And really, if you want to get down to it, the eugenicists were essentially supported by all these leading psychologists, educational psychologists at the time, because basically these guys had brought over what was Binet's original IQ test from France, and Binet was like, he made this test to test little kids just to see if there were some, just to see if they had some developmental disabilities, for instance. And then these U.S. psychologists, in their sort of crass pragmatism, brought these tests over wholesale and said, "Hey, we're going to test these large populations of humans, particularly those enrolled in the army or enlisted in the army, and then use these tests to make these broad conclusions that around the different IQ levels of different people." Now, and so we have to understand that current standardized testing has its roots in these very, very racist, classist um, uh, um, tests of these time, and people now are like, nah, we don't that how can that be? And you just need to look like even like look up Carl Brigham. There's a Brigham library connected to the original makers of the SAT, right? He was a noted eugenicist. He had all these racist notions behind him, and he still gets upheld. And then even now we can look at folks, if you're familiar back from the 90s, there was like the bell curve, was this book that came out that used tests to supposedly measure the IQ of different groups, and came out to these same conclusions, right? That black folks supposedly have a lower IQ than white folks, right? And so you can see these notions that they keep surfacing, they keep resurfacing and bubbling up throughout history, and they are far from dead, especially now as we see sort of the rise of like racist xenophobia here in the United States. And I think it continues to be used as the tests continue to be used as justifications for our existing inequality. And on that point, one of the things I like to always note about this history of standardized testing and what later became high stakes standardized testing in the United States is that there's something funky, there's something going on when the current results of modern day tests essentially produce almost exactly the same outcomes as these early standardized IQ tests. We still have poor folks, poor black and brown folks in particular, and like ELL students, like these folks have lower scores now, and guess what? Same kind of scores happened 100 years ago. So that always begs the question. You have to just ask, okay, so what are we really measuring here? Okay, and that's something I think lurks behind all these arguments around high stakes standardized testing. Which brings me then to, if I want to get to the next question on, are these tests necessary to protect kids of color? Okay, now we hear this all the time, and there have been all sorts of struggles, around some very mainstream civil rights groups saying we need this testing to hold teachers and schools accountable for educating kids of color, right? In fact, that was the whole impetus behind No Child Left Behind, and that's how No Child Left Behind sort of gained its political and rhetorical power, right? Was by saying this is literally it's in it's in the language of the law, right? No child left behind, right? So they took this idea of racial achievement gaps and then launched education policy around that. Now, there's a lot of things to sort of think through when we look at that. Number one, like I just pointed out, the outcomes of these tests have basically been the same for 100 years. And so you have to ask the question: is it actually measuring something of value or that's real with regards to holding schools and teachers accountable, right? And one piece we have to be clear on, as we have this discussion, we know that um, institutionalized racism and individual racism, right, for instance, is rampant as structural inequality exists in our school system, right? And really, we need to be clear that our teachers and administrators and our policymakers and our school systems, we do need to deal with the racial inequality, class inequality. ELO students need to be better served. Students in special education need to be better served. Like that has to be upfront for all of our conversations around this, because as soon as we don't attend to that, then we run into real difficulties, because that's the basis for which these mainstream civil rights groups turn around and say we need the tests in order to essentially hold these teachers accountable, right? Because there's a history of like teachers in sometimes being like, okay, as long as you're quiet and not disrupting class, all right, you black kids, just go sit in the back of the room and we're just going to keep going, and I'm not going to worry about teaching you, right? And like that kind of stuff happens, okay? And so that becomes the basis for this argument around: do we need the tests to protect kids of color, to make sure their needs are being met, and to hold these schools and these teachers accountable? But the issue really then comes down to like what do the tests do in terms of kids of color? Okay, um, uh, we know for a fact, right? We've had No Child Left Behind. We've had nationwide high stakes standardized testing. Going back at this point, going back just about 14 years now, right? And over that period of time, if you want to put validity in the test scores, we have not seen we do not see any closing of any achievement gaps, test score achievement gaps across racial groups. And so basically, we've got this policy we've been using and saying, oh, we give the tests and it's going to fix inequality, and it hasn't done that, right? And so, part of my argument is like, okay, if you're really out to fix things for kids of color, then why are you continuing to use a policy and a policy tool that actually has been shown for over a decade now to not do the job, right? That doesn't make any kind of sense. Okay, so that's one piece of this. Um, the other piece is to say, okay, so what does it mean to like meet the needs of kids of color, and are the tests doing this? Now, if we want to look at what's going on inside of classrooms in terms of curriculum, for instance, kids of color are actually facing the pressures from high stakes standardized testing at much disproportionately and higher rates than other kids, okay, than white kids and affluent kids. Um, and so what that means is that you're getting more, test prep, drill and kill. You here in Seattle in particular, there are some schools in the in the south end of Seattle that only have 15 minutes of recess in a day, elementary schools. Okay, and it's because these schools, which are predominantly students of color, have low test scores, and so the schools are moving more and more to test prep and just cutting out, the things that aren't tested. And so recess, which is crazy, right? We know that recess and movement, and we're talking about kids, right? So we know that recess, we know that movement is so critical for good brain development. And then there's all the social emotional stuff that, I mean, like there's so much that gets wrapped into even something as what's seemingly simple as recess in terms of kids learning and their own healthy development as human beings. Um, but that stuff gets cut in response to trying to raise test scores, like when the education goal becomes the test scores. And so we see this here in Seattle. It's happening nationwide. And so to that degree, you could say that the testing is actually causing a degradation in the quality of education for kids of color specifically. Another piece of this is we have to talk about kids' identities in the classroom too, right? And do we have a curriculum that can speak to their identities and also speak to the social and cultural conditions in terms of dealing with racism, in terms of dealing with oppression inside and outside of schools, right? And so then what we see is schools start to move towards the tested subjects of language arts and mathematics. What that means is that there is not only is there no space, but it just gets shrunk and shrunk. There's no room for like multicultural education, culturally responsive education. Let's talk about ethnic studies, right? I mean, we've got research that shows that having an ethnic studies curriculum that can speaks to the kids' identities, speaks to the identities of their communities, is good for their education. Okay, it can improve their high school graduation, improve their college entrance rates. But but in the face of trying to teach to the tests again, which is concentrated, and these effects are concentrated much more disproportionately in low-income communities and communities of color, that these curricular decisions that could be having a really really strong impact in those communities, they're getting squished away. They're getting squeezed out of the curriculum because it's stuff that's not on the tests. Okay, and so I would argue that when you just sort of look at it, even though there's this whole thing about needing to hold folks accountable, is to say, look, but at the same time, you're actually creating a really, really low quality education for kids of color. And is that really what you want? Is that your goal here? Also, part of the discussion needs to be okay. Um, um, if we need to look at okay, so maybe the tests aren't really measuring teaching and learning. Okay. Um, the strongest correlation we have for the tests is actually like family income, right? It's about wealth and educational opportunity that exists outside of schools. And so if that's what you're measuring, then why are you using this tool that mainly measures family wealth and income that exists outside of school to hold teachers and schools accountable, right? There's all sorts of other things we can be looking at, whether it's discipline rates, whether it's where we look at attrition and graduation. I mean, I want to have us, and there's some of us here in Seattle have been talking about doing this work around, let's create a different sort of quote unquote accountability system. And I hate that word accountability right now, especially in this current context. But let's talk about creating a different kind of accountability system where we set out these measures about what means what counts for a quality education for our children, right? What, like, do you have art? Do you have music? Okay, do you have a language program? Are there counselors, staffed and funded counselors at your school? Are there nurses? Okay, do you have libraries and librarians? What's the ratio of counselors to kids? Um, you know, like there are so many other metrics we can use to say, okay, this is what it means to have a good education, and this is what we want to hold our schools accountable for, right? And I'd encourage us to sort of think about that. Is there multicultural education? Is there strong community engagement? What, and these should be tied to other kinds of educational outcomes. How can we find ways for kids to demonstrate their knowledge and learning? How can we find ways for them to do that are connected to who they are as people, that are connected to their communities, that are of value to them, and that like part of this means rejecting the idea that our educational outcomes have to be of value for the profit makers. Like they do not have to be of value for Pearson or for any of these outside entities. It's about what's valuable for us as a community and what do we think makes an educated kid. And so I don't think we need high stakes standardized testing to ensure a quality education for kids of color. In fact, it's doing just the opposite, and we need to work on better and truer, and in this case, more democratic and more process-based metrics for understanding, for protecting the needs and of kids of color, making sure that they are being treated well as whole human beings, as cultural beings, as active and activist beings in our world and society. And again, so this again would then lead me to wrap around to the third point, which is how does high stakes testing relate to white supremacy? So part of it to me is that when you is this knowledge question, the curriculum question, okay, where we have testing is essentially here we have these standards created by outside entities, and then we have these tests also created by outside entities supposedly to measure those standards, and then those are essentially brought down on a far and basically dropped on us, right? They're dropped on our local communities, and so then you got to say, okay, wait a minute, like to what degree is that an act of colonization? Okay, are is the knowledge of the community, are the kids' identities, the various facets of their identities, is that included are those included in these standards? Are we testing on those things? Are we trying to measure those things, right? And so these tests, again, from outside entities that are made to be essentially decontextualized from our kids, from their cultures, from their communities, are just brought in and plopped in on us and get used literally to attack, right? Low-income communities and schools of color, or schools that have predominantly kids of color. And so to me, there's a piece of colonization within that. It's a colonial model. Oh, excuse me. Okay, sorry, my computer fell asleep right then. All right. Um, so then the other piece is then let's think about how that relates to curriculum, right? So as we have like multicultural curriculum, ethnic studies curriculum being pushed out, right, in order to supposedly raise test scores. That's what people say. We got to teach to the test, so we can't have this other stuff. It doesn't really count, right? And so there's a couple things there. What does it mean to say like, oh hey, you know what, your knowledge and your history and your culture that doesn't really count. Okay, so that's again, there's an act of white supremacy that comes down through that. It says, you know what, this set of knowledge is important, but this set of knowledge that's not important. You know what matters for you, or maybe what's going on your own, knowing some of your own history and your own culture and making sure that's part of the curriculum. Oh, that doesn't matter because it's not on the test. Okay, and that's a critical thing here in terms of thinking about the relationship between high stakes testing and white supremacy is this curricular piece. There's a couple other pieces too you could look at. We could look at the disproportionate impact on teachers of color, right? Where there's a lot of teachers of color who go into teaching because they want to foster and strengthen the identities of the kids in their community, right? But again, with the pressures from the testing, it creates this space where these teachers of color are like, man, I can't be who I want to be, and I also can't help these kids be who they are because of the tests. Okay, so you get this whole this cycle where essentially whiteness ends up being reproduced and reinstantiated through the tests, both in terms of the teaching core and then in terms of what the kids get to learn. And then finally, one of the biggest things, and one of the things that people don't like to talk about, is the fact that there's been some research to actually show that when you have, for instance, a high stakes exit exam, that increases the chances of being incarcerated for youth by 12.5%. And this is a study from Baker and Lang in 2013, right? So now I'll say it again. When you have a high stakes high school exit exam, a standardized test that's tied to high school graduation, it increases the chance of incarceration for youth by 12.5%. All right. So then you got to say, okay, so let's connect that dot, because the next dot is to say, okay, well, who fails these exams? And it's predominantly low income brown kids. All right. And so by having these exams, if one of the major outcomes of these exams is results in the increase in incarceration rate of low income brown kids by 12.5%, right? Like this again ends up being a way that this kind of testing ends up enforcing white supremacy and being an active part of the schools to prison pipeline. Okay, and as my man Dave Stovall was just here in town this weekend, he doesn't even call it a pipeline anymore. He says it's a nexus, because schools become a place where this kind of disciplining and this instantiation of white supremacy happens at the school level, and schools, through testing and through various discipline policies, end up not they're not they're no they don't act just as a pipeline. They sort of act as a space of where you get the embodiment of the prison-like stuff happening in the schools, right? And so these are the ways that I sort of see high stakes testing being, in addition to the racist history and the rooting in eugenics, the racialized outcomes of the tests now and the disproportionate policies and the disproportionate discipline are ways that I see high stakes standardized testing contributing directly to white supremacy. As for best strategies, first of all, y'all don't need to tell y'all don't need me to tell you about best strategies. The folks in Philly I know have been holding it down and just raising a ruckus around testing. And we see it, we see it in Chicago. We got folks here in Seattle. I mean, there are folks based in the community resisting the tests in myriad of forms, right? And so I can't say I have any particular hold on what we might consider to be a quote unquote best strategy. Um, Now I do know that if we opt out, if we say this kid is not going to take this test, or these kids aren't going to take this test, right? If we do that opting out, and as a parent, this hits home for me. I literally just this morning, my son is in kindergarten here at the school down the block, um, and they started doing map testing, right, which is a computer-based test for 5-year-olds, 5.5-year-olds. It's crazy, okay? And so I just wrote my opt-out note this morning and sent it off to the principal. And fortunately for me, there are multiple teachers at my son's school that are sympathetic or actually very supportive of opting out. And at this point, the administration is at least willing to put up with me. Okay, but this whole thing about opting out hits home for me right now because literally right now, my son today had to have a different opportunity, different activity while everyone else tested in his kindergarten class. Um, Anyways, but what happens is when we refuse the test, okay, we got to think about it sort of in the same way we might think about conscientious objectors were for World War II or for Vietnam. Okay, it's this whole thing that here's this whole entire education reform machine, right? Every single attack on public education is based on test scores. Okay, so when we opt out of testing, we pull the data away from the system, and the whole system runs on data, right? And so what the opting out does is it just takes the fuel away. Okay, it takes the oxygen out. Here's this fire, it takes the oxygen away so that fire can't burn. Okay, here's this machine that runs, and that's like closing schools and pushing charters and doing all this stuff. Attacking teachers and the teaching profession, attacking teachers unions. Whole thing runs on test scores. You take the test scores away, it has no more fuel and it has to shut down. It cannot run without that data. So to me, that's the most critical thing. But we know that's different. Like it means different things for different communities. Sometimes opting out is going to take away some future educational opportunities, and so I recognize when folks have to make that decision around their kids. I understand that. And we also know that opting out for teachers is very different than for parents. When it comes to opting out, parents have that power. Okay, schools can figure out ways to penalize people, but it's not like they're going to take away my job for me opting my son out of the tests. Okay, but teachers, that's a different space. And so the main thing around all of that though is just to be like, look, it all has to be collective action. Okay, when the map test boycott happened here at Garfield High School, going back a few years now, it was all those teachers. It was a unanimous decision, and sans one abstention for one of the flagship high schools here in Seattle that decided to not give this test. Okay, and they had very sound reasons for it. And then they built up collective power around that. They had the PTA came on board and supported them. Student leadership then came on board and supported them. And then support started pouring in from like around the country and even around the world, right? And so what happens is when you make these things more collective, um, it makes the political cost for retribution from the administration or the district or the state or whoever the authority might be, it makes that political cost much higher than if it was an individual teacher, right, or an individual student just deciding to opt out. Because then they got to be like, man, okay, we might look bad if we do this, this, or this, or we can't fire all the teachers in our school at the same time. Like we just couldn't recover from that. So the piece I really want to highlight then is and push on is sort of the organizing, the coalition building, and the collectivity of doing our resistance to high stakes standardized testing. Um, and then the smallest piece, the thing I tell people when I go out and give talks around opting out and the problems with high stakes standardized testing is just to say there's a range of things you can do, and a lot of that is dependent on your local situation. Some spaces we have principals who are vocally in support of opting out, and they support their staff. Some places we have principals who support it, but they don't feel like they can do it publicly, so they're like working quietly maybe with teachers and parents in their school community, and doing small things like saying, okay, you know what, we'll pay for food at your meeting, or maybe we'll pay for a translator, that kind of stuff. And then some places we have principals who are on board with high stakes standardized testing and will work to essentially try and crush anyone who resists them. Right? We have principals here in Seattle who are essentially lying to immigrant communities, giving them misinformation because they don't want them to opt out of the test, right? So I mean, we can have a range of responses, and I think our responses are going to be dependent on our particular context. And I want everyone to sort of keep that in mind, that there isn't sort of a universal, response. I would say unless we have like a nationwide opt-out movement that was coordinated and ready to go, and we just shut it down, which I would love to have happen, by the way. But in that range, though, a lot of it has to do with education. And so I'm negotiating this now as a parent with my son's school, because there's a school full of professionals there, of professional teachers, staff, et cetera, administration. And a lot of it is like folks just don't know stuff, right? And so I feel like, at the very least, short of opting out, and we have to be spreading the word and doing as much educating as possible, and initiating these conversations. Okay, at a lot of schools here in Seattle, these conversations are being pushed by the PTAs. mainly because the PTAs, again, because of the parents, have a particular kind of power that they can operate and put out there in a way that's of less risk than the teachers. But we have to start doing this education because people don't understand the assessments. They don't understand high stakes standardized. They don't understand standardized testing. Then they don't really understand high stakes standardized testing, and instead they tend to get caught up in sort of the the media machine and its presentation of these tests. And again, here in Seattle, in the backyard of Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation, our local newspaper is just terrible about any of this stuff. So anyway, so to me, broad-based coalition, do as much education as possible. We need broad-based coalitions, and we need to be pushing for organized strategies. One amongst them could be opting out, or in the very least, making sure parents are informed of their rights to opt out. Okay, because we're in this very odd period of history where parents are being where districts are basically communicating to teachers and administrators, you cannot inform people of their rights. Okay, and there's nothing sort of more anti-democratic than that. It's to me, I don't know. There's something happening here when that's the case, when that's the fight. You are not allowed to know your rights, so you're not allowed to exercise your rights. Um, anyway, so that's what I see in terms of best strategy, and none of it's easy, and I'm trying to do it myself in my own context. Um, and so with that, I just burned 30 minutes. Thanks again. It's always an honor to get a chance to speak to folks. I wish I was there in person, but schedules and resources just didn't work out in order for that to happen. But keep pushing, Philly. I know y'all doing good out there, and yeah, let's continue the conversation. All right, take care.